In part 1 of my UFC Fight Pass Invitational 4 analysis, I talked about this position here, and I referred to it as the knee outside the hip position, but I asked if anyone knew what it was actually called. And thank you all for providing a lot of answers, and the leader was probably hip pin, but a close second was Captain Morgan. And there were a few references to Danaher's open guard instructional, and in that instructional, Danaher refers to Gordon as the master of this position. And then it hit me. Why not just ask Gordon what they call the position? So I did, and his answer was better than I could have imagined.
My king.
Gordon said that if you're able to off-balance your opponent to their hand, they call that A1 for Ashi 1. And if you're able to put them on their hip, they call that A2. Now, I'm not entirely sure why, but I find it very interesting and insightful that they distinguish between the two. So I went ahead and updated the database to match this terminology. So now when you type in Gordon Ryan A1, you can see that he was able to get to A1 at 13 minutes and 27 seconds into his match against Andre Galvao. And from A1, you can see that Andre takes a big step with his secondary leg to realign himself with Gordon. And Gordon uses that as an opportunity to grab Andre's second foot, off balance him down to a hip, wrestle up, and take top position. And if you're like, dude, that database sounds
fucking sick. I would highly recommend.
If you follow the link down below and fill out the form, I'll shoot you an email when we launch it, which will hopefully be at the beginning of August. And I'm still ironing out the details, but there is going to be some incentive for the first people that sign up for the database. So if you're interested in updates, follow the link down below. And now let's dive into part 2 of the UFC Fight Pass Invitational 4 analysis. If you're watching this video, you probably know that Nicky Rod likes the body lock pass. And you also probably know that Big Dan weighs 290 pounds. And you're probably wondering how Nicky Rod was able to successfully use the body lock to pass Big Dan's guard. Now, it's hard to hear, but if you listen closely, you can hear Gordon coaching Dan and saying something about a 2-on-1 grip and a body lock.
He's got great leg locks. Let's see if, Nicky...
Now, I wasn't entirely sure what this meant, so I figured it was a good idea to go back and watch Gordon's match against Nicky and figure out how Gordon is using 2-on-1 grips to defend the body lock. And we see here as Gordon kicks Nicky away and sits up. He's immediately looking for a 2-on-1 grip. Again, here we see Gordon playing from half guard and trying to get a 2-on-1 grip on the far arm. And before Gordon takes his back off the mat, he makes sure he has control over that far arm. But this time, Nicky has a grip on Gordon's wrist. So this time when Gordon sits up, Nicky's able to successfully connect his hands. Now, Nicky's not able to do anything with his hands connected, and I think the way Gordon responds after he escapes this position is very telling. As soon as Gordon gets out of this body lock, he immediately goes for this 2-on-1 arm drag grip on the far arm, and his near foot is on the thigh of Nicky, meaning it's going to be very difficult for Nicky to initiate a body lock pass if Gordon has control over that far arm. And even if Nicky is somehow able to free that far arm, Gordon's foot is acting as a secondary line of defense, making it extremely difficult for Nicky to get close enough to Gordon to connect his hands. And if Gordon were to reach for something like a collar tie, you better believe this foot is going to be on the thigh. So just based on these clues, I think this is a very disciplined position to take if you're trying to prevent a body lock pass. So if we go back and watch Big Dan versus Nicky, you can see Nicky's the one who has control over Dan's arm. And as Dan sits up, it looks like he's going for some sort of cross shoulder post or collar tie. Now he's able to swim his hand in just in the nick of time to save him, but this was very close to a body lock entry. But this time we see Dan sitting up with no control over that far arm, and Nicky's the one who actually has control over Dan's foot, so he's not able to use it as a frame. And with his right arm, this time Dan is looking for a collar tie. And immediately Nicky shoots in to connect his hands on the body lock and quickly pass the guard. Now again, when we saw Gordon sitting up from a similar situation, all of his attention is going to that 2-on-1 grip on the arm. And that 2-on-1 grip is what leads to counter offense. Now off of this 2-on-1 grip, Nicky is likely going to bring his head down and push with his other arm. And when this happens, Gordon typically brings his attention to the other arm. And in response, Nicky will bring his head up. And now we're playing the game. Gordon starts by taking a 2-on-1 grip on the far arm, and Nicky counters by bringing his head low and bringing his elbow inside the knee of Gordon. So Gordon brings his foot to the top of Nicky's thigh as he brings his attention to the near arm. And in doing so, Nicky's head comes up and Gordon's able to start getting underneath. Here in ADCC, we see Gordon using his right hand to push down Nicky's near arm, and in response, Nicky's head rises. So Gordon starts to work for that 2-on-1 grip. Doesn't work, no problem, reboot the system. Gordon pushes the near arm down, Nicky's head rises, Gordon sits up to go for that 2-on-1 grip. And now Nicky really tries to disengage by pushing off of that near arm, and Gordon is able to enter into his attacks, and we all know how this one ends. I can do this all day. Gordon has a 2-on-1 grip on the far arm. Nicky brings his head down, so Gordon takes a grip on the near arm. Nicky brings his head up, Gordon goes into a knee lever. And I think by now you get the point. Now I'm not 100% sure, I'm just trying to put the pieces together here. But when Gordon sits up, he's looking to prioritize control over that far arm with a 2-on-1 grip. And that is what I think he was trying to get Dan to do. Now let's talk about this armbar escape that I've heard Danaher call the Passover escape, but it seems like everyone's starting to call it the reverse hitchhiker.
Nicky Rod hits a move that's basically a reverse hitchhiker. I think it's one of the best ways to escape a fully extended armbar.
And basically there's two battles taking place here. One of the battles is the defender would like to get their head to the outside of their opponent's leg. And a very similar thing happened to Owen O'Flanagan at ADCC. But the problem is no one knows how to spell Owen's last name, so just type in Owen the Great and it should come up. And here we see the armbar sequence that we're looking for happened at 110 into the match.
Fuck, this is sick, man.
And the battle that's being played here is Shanji is trying to bring his head to the outside of Owen's leg. And Owen transfers to different leg configurations to prevent this from happening. But eventually Shanji is able to free his head, get it to the outside of Owen's leg, and successfully escape. The second battle taking place is the defender wants their arm on the bottom hip, and they want their thumb pointed down. So if the attacker is able to keep a frame in front of their opponent's face and the arm on their top hip, they're going to get a strong finish. And the higher you can get your hip, the stronger your finish is going to be. So a good way to raise the height of your hip is to step on your own ankle. Now a standard hitchhiker escape is the opposite. The defender wants their arm on the top hip and they want to get their head down to the mat. Now a good way for the attacker to prevent the defender from getting their forehead to the mat is to control the far shoulder. And a great way to control the far shoulder is to cross your feet. So now if the attacker, Alan Sanchez, can bring Oliver Taza's arm down to the bottom hip, he's going to get a strong finish. But Taza makes this extremely difficult for Alan Sanchez to achieve by bridging and forcing his arm to the top hip. But he's not just going to sit here and let Alan Sanchez break his arm. His first order of business is going to be to free his far shoulder. So he prevents his arm from being broken while he works to separate the feet of Alan Sanchez and free his shoulder. And once he's freed his shoulder, now his goal is to free his head. And once he's able to free his head, he's able to successfully get his forehead to the mat and complete the hitchhiker escape. Now, when we're talking about this armbar escape, I think the main principle behind it is what Nicky Ryan talks about here.
I felt like you were a little too gung-ho on just trying to get the figure four locked versus breaking him down first. You got him into like a front headlock here, right? And then he went to go start four-pointing and standing up, right? And as he was four-pointing and standing up, that's when you were trying to lock it, and then his head eventually slipped out, right? So versus just trying to immediately transfer the figure four as they're standing up, focus on breaking him down to a hip first and then going for the figure four.
I really like that idea because you're going more control first that eventually leads to the submission instead of just slapping it on there over a reaction.
Yeah, exactly.
The idea of knowing when you should be focused on finishing a submission versus when you should be worried about maintaining control is a big one. And I imagine it's extremely difficult to implement in the heat of the moment with $30,000 on the line. But the idea is most armbars start to go south if you let your opponent stack you. So as the attacker, if you start to get stacked, now is not the time to think about submitting, it's the time to think about control.
So you managed to fully bridge on top like so, right? Yep. From here, you were still focused on trying to break the grip, but your goal from here should be to return him back down to the mat.
So if we watch this first armbar escape here, you can see Dan starts with his bottom hand on the mat, and he has his feet crossed, really controlling that far shoulder. Now this right hand on the mat is preventing Nicky from stacking, but Dan immediately takes it off the mat and uses it to break Nicky's grip. So Nicky starts to turn towards the stack. And you can see Dan extends his body to prevent the stack, but Nicky's able to punch his far shoulder through the lock of Dan's legs and ultimately complete the escape. And now we get to see this same idea playing out in the second round, where Dan immediately takes his right hand off the mat and is able to break the grip of Nicky Rod and extend the arm. But this time, Nicky's not able to free his far shoulder right away, but he's still able to use the momentum of the sit-up to throw his back to the mat, elbow Dan's feet, and free his far shoulder and ultimately his head, as he works to sit up and turn the corner. But Dan does a really good job using his knee as a frame. So Nicky tries to turn back for a hitchhiker escape, but Dan's foot is there, shutting it down. And then Dan tries to throw his foot over to recapture Nicky's head in what they call a scissor juji. But Nicky was successfully able to point his thumb down, free his head, and escape the position. Now, I think it's easy for me to sit here and say things like maybe Dan should have gone foot to foot like Gordon did to raise the height of the fulcrum and get more braking pressure, which is the same thing you do for a knee bar.
I had to go foot over foot, which is the most dominant form of that move in terms of braking mechanics. When I did, I started to feel the knee crunch, very similar to other times I had applied that move in competitions.
But in reality, Marigali just finished Cyborg with a very similar armbar. And in my opinion, it's not necessarily because his braking mechanics were better, it's just because Cyborg was tired. So a big part of this escape was just Nicky Rod wanting it really bad. And what I wanted to highlight is just the overall principle that I think is taking place here. And that is the idea that Dan focused immediately on offense and getting the arm extended. And that allowed Nicky to start sitting up and creating movement and momentum. And he used that movement to start breaking down the control of Dan and eventually escaping. Now again, I'm not saying Dan did anything wrong here, it's just a strategy. And a different strategy would be to try and focus on control initially. But even then, there are ways people can escape, like Alan Sanchez throwing up a triangle at EBI.
If Sanchez gets a tap from the defensive position, it'll be the most epic thing that's ever happened at EBI.
So no one strategy is going to work every time, and that's why we play the game. But connecting this back to the body lock passing, you can see Dan's left foot here could be going to the hip, but instead it goes in between Nicky's legs, probably with the intention of doing something offensive, which led to a body lock pass. And the way he played the overtime rounds was also very aggressive, which ultimately led to Nicky escaping in very dramatic fashion. Now, I don't really have too much to say about the rest of the event. During the regulation period of Craig Jones versus Pena, the star was the coin. And I've already made a ton of videos talking about the back. But the basic idea is that there are two general strategies. And a lot of people to start the overtime round are going to try and throw themselves to the overhook side and get their back to the mat. So much so that it's probably worth it to test the waters and see how much lean you can get away with to start the overtime round. And the other general strategy is to throw yourself to the underhook side and try and turn towards turtle and go into a turning escape. And in general, you're going to have to combine these escapes together. So if you're on the overhook side trying to get your back to the mat and your opponent switches to the underhook side, now you can go into a turning escape. But if you try and do a turning escape from the overhook side, it's probably going to be very labored and slow, and can lead to you getting finished. And I think one of the coolest things that I've been doing recently that I've had a lot of success with, that I first noticed from Andrew Tackett in this video here, and I saw Helena do it as well, where we're on the underhook side and her opponent has good defensive hands in place. You can see Emily has a good C grip controlling the strangle arm of Helena. But as Emily tries to switch sides, Helena takes out her underhook and pushes down on the elbow of Emily, which makes that C grip very weak, and Emily is forced to switch her grip on the strangle arm to a monkey grip. And from here, it's just a matter of time before Helena is able to cinch it up and get the finish. And again, going back to where I originally saw this, the defender initially has a very good defensive grip on the strangle arm. But as Andrew pushes down on the elbow, the defender is forced to switch their grip, and Andrew is able to use this as an opportunity to finish the match. Now, if you want to see the rest of that video, I'll link it here. And hopefully you found this video helpful, as I was able to get back to my roots and talk about Gordon a bunch, as well as advertise from my self-made database. And remember, if you want updates, be sure to use the link down below, and I'll see you in the next video.